Hi people. Life and death so elusive, the difference so small. A second is more than enough to determine the outcome. A single action, a single cast. Sometimes a second is longer than the time span you even have at your disposal. A great example was the poison from the stingers in AQ40, which by the way were made substantially harder by the spell batching. If the charge occurs a second after the poison, well then you'd have a second to dispel it. First of all, if you had just casted a spell and your global cooldown was active, then there would be nothing you could do except wait and watch and maybe pray. Second of all, the spell batch of 400 milliseconds would effectively reduce the time you had to react by 40%. If you didn't dispel at least 0.4 seconds before the charge, the target would still take the massively increased damage, because the game counted the charge and the dispels happening at the same time. Which actually kind of reminds you of quantum physics. The debuff is both there and not there at the same time. It sounded like trash, it felt like trash. Anyway, what I started and will continue talking about is of course healing, an interesting and also somewhat cursed part of the game. I've healed a lot through the expansions and I do enjoy it. Or at least I did, I'm not so sure anymore after certain experiences. Regardless, it is also a bit weird. There are certain core skills associated with healing, especially raid healing, that most people don't consider at first. A fun part is how you have to deal with situations where the tank might drop from full health to 0 in just a matter of say 2 seconds. In that situation, you won't have time to react. By the time the first blow is dealt, you have to already be halfway through finishing a cast. So you have to constantly precast, cancelling the spell just before it goes off should the healing not be needed, in order to save your mana. To further complicate things, say that the tank on average takes 1000 damage per second. Well, in that case, a skilled and geared healer might be able to solo heal it, and 2 healers should have a very easy time. But the tank might take sudden spikes of damage, maybe a crushing blow followed by a melee ability, making the tank suddenly need several times the average HPS for a very short time. Anyway, we're getting away from the point of this video. By now I'm sure I've made the impression that I have at least healed once or twice in my life prior to this video, and that you might view what I say as something not just taken out of the blue. Maybe you won't agree, but at least you might be able to see where it comes from. So, I now present to you, in a somewhat random order, the worst parts of being a healer. Damage dealers, or even tanks, sometimes seem fully unable to see the blue bar beneath the healer's health bar. It's like some sort of local blindness, and come to speak of it, sometimes then they seem unable to see the green health bar itself. Maybe because it doesn't exist, because a player is dead. But they should notice how it's not only full, but rather entirely gone. Or at least you might think they would notice, but not too rarely they don't. They keep pulling over and over. You might even be resurrecting the dead player when the tank goes for a stroll straight into the next pack all by himself. He charges in, does 3 abilities and dies. You might think people would learn from their mistakes, but you'd be surprised how common it is that they don't. As long as people don't die, they rarely consider whether they might have done something wrong. And although it doesn't always lead to a wipe, it's just a waste of time. It's also somewhat weird considering how easy it is to wait 10 seconds, you literally have to do nothing. It might be a case that most people learn eventually, but perhaps there is always a steady stream of new players that haven't learned. And so the problem persists, but let's say that the owners change. You know when you're sitting on Discord during a raid, and there is silence or perhaps some mumbling of directions from the raid leader, but they're suddenly and harshly interrupted by someone screaming, "Heal me! Quickly!" Or potentially they might say their name instead of me, because through trial and error they realize that if they say their name, the chances of them actually getting a heal is bigger. There are after all 24 options when trying to find out who me is in a raid group. It's just so bad for several reasons. What does that player even think healers are doing in the first place? Well, supposing the healers aren't away from keyboard, but that seems to very rarely be the case, to be honest. Often healers are awake and alert because they have to be. Often the origin of the scream is a damage dealer, lost in some sort of rotation reverie or enchanted by the big numbers on their screen, which they can't take their eyes off. They don't see the threat bar going red, they don't notice the boss's bar going yellow from the threats, nor do they notice the fire they're standing in. But suddenly, the 5-story tall boss suddenly turns towards them and launches a spear twice their size of the player right through the player's body, or maybe even cleaves them with an axe the size of a small house or a big house. Then suddenly the damage dealer's blissful state of nothingness is interrupted and he emits a massive roar of dislike and discomfort. It's sort of like an infant being suddenly started. It's peculiar and it's retarded. No healer liked those players. To be honest, no one liked those players except possibly themselves and other players that are like them. And any healer that can still differentiate between light and darkness clearly sees how a health bar, which they've been staring at constantly for the entire raid, drops down and needs a heal. Now imagine all this, except the player is the tank. And tank's health drops quite often in the Burning Crusade. I'm not sure what to even say in the end, I guess just mute those players or turn their volume down. Remember how dual wheel tanking was the hot new thing in Classic compared to previous expansions or iterations of the game?
No! I am a slave no longer.
Warrior specking mainly into the Fury tree and then dual wielding for that extra threat. I once saw a bunch of streamers in a very early Molten Core run in Classic do this. I mean having the tank dual wield for the extra threats. But the tank was partly in greens, so obviously sometimes he dropped dead instantly. Like a dead bird falling from the sky, except very fast. There's no tumble, there's no long fall. It's rather some sort of multiplied gravity that pulled them down from the sky as if they were thrown. That's how hard he dropped. And the fact that the tank didn't stop dual wielding and instead equip a shield to actually sort of stay alive, that's just something extraordinary. Technically, if you ignore some parts of reality, it is true that this was the healer's fault. Because as long as you don't go from 100 to 0 instantly, some amount of HPS could have kept you alive. If healers could heal everyone for several thousand each second forever, then tanks wouldn't be needed. Or at least not tanks with any sort of mitigation. Warriors might have competed for holding aggro, as that gives a massive amount of rage. Healers, of course, can't heal everyone for several thousand every second forever. They can only heal so much, and they only have so much mana. Healing is only part of the equation of not dying. Mitigation gear, crowd control, slows, damage reduction, and so on and forth, they're all required in some combination with healing. But some tanks refuse to accept this. They might say that, well, there was once another healer with full business slots that was able to keep me alive when I did these pulls, so it's not my fault that I'm dying. The fact that you're newly dinged with not too many epics is not considered, nor is the fact that the tank requires 1600 HPS during the entire pull considered. But it's not only tanks doing this. Damage dealers often pump until they get aggro, and then continue to pump instead of stopping DPS to let the tank regain aggro. Not sure what their plan is, they probably never had one in the first place, except to pump and never stop. Yeah, you know what, that probably was their entire plan. Let's say a damage dealer stands in the fire, which obviously shouldn't be done. Who pays for that? Well, the damage dealer once he dies, but the healer for as long as the damage dealer is alive. Who pays when the tank makes an unreasonably big pull, or even when someone ninja pull? The healer, as that's the one having to heal the chaos that emerges. Who pays when people can't follow tactics? In the end, it's the healer. Sure, everyone pays for a wipe in the sense that you failed your attempt and you won't get loot, and you have to pay repair costs. But when people just generally mess around and don't do things properly, the responsibility ultimately falls on the healers to deal with it. People might even ignore tactics entirely just to deal more damage. For example, if they might need to run away from the boss for a short while to avoid AoE, they might just ignore that. And sure, if you have strong healers, it might be worth it. as the increased DPS might speed things up for you. But the healers should have a say in it at least. Maybe it works for now, but it might eventually lead to the healers being long before the fight is over, and that will cause a wipe. And on top of that, the damage dealers might indirectly be saying that they don't care if it becomes stressful to keep everyone up when they're ignoring the tactics like they do, because their damage is more important. Essentially, they're saying that they are more important than you are, and you should just kind of serve them. The truth is often technically the opposite. Almost all fights can be done with very low DPS, as there is often no mechanic except for potential and rage that truly sets the damage requirements. As long as people stay alive, you could probably drag out a fight quite a lot, but you need the healing. Often you can't heal with half the HPS and still kill a boss, and having healers go is a great way to massively reduce healing output and secure your wipe. Imagine if the punishment for failing to follow a mechanic was a reduction in damage output instead of the player taking damage. Damage dealers would become some sort of ninja ballerinas, executing strategies and avoiding mechanics flawlessly all the time. The way it works now is often the opposite. In order to deal as much damage as possible, you have to take more damage. Why run away from Prince Malekazar, or whatever his name is, before his Shadow Nova if you didn't get the debuff? It's literally just a DPS loss for you. Or care about spreading on Gruul as long as you don't die. It's just a damage loss if you focus more on spreading instead of continuing to DPS. The worst part of healing is without a doubt that you're the one paying for everyone's mistakes, or even worse, their carelessness. It's like having to deal with a 5-year-old that wants to play in the rain but completely refuses to put on a rain jacket, and then they'll come crying and complaining about being wet. But despite all these things, healing can still be rather enjoyable. It can often be a more complex and interesting minigame than simply dealing damage. Meanwhile, many players are stuck in boring one-button rotations in Classic, and to a certain extent still are in the Burning Crusade. Healers get to use a bigger part of their toolkit to react to different situations. It's also very hard to master, meaning you can always improve, and the difference between an okay healer and a great one is often very noticeable. So meanwhile you might agree with these things being some of the worst parts of healing, you will hopefully still continue to play a healer. Deep down, everyone loves you and fears you, as you hold the power of deciding who lives and who dies. And if someone behaves in a particularly rude and selfish way, perhaps you should just give them a small reminder of why they need you. Or not, maybe just telling them to stop could work in some cases. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe. Also, if you want to, you can join my Discord Cloudy Days, there's a link in the description. I'll be back soon with another video, and until then, see ya!